think it's safe to say that the stat on the Rings of Power viewership of Season 1 dropping 60% to Season 2 is a little blown out of proportion, and the whole story isn't told. I hope to tell that whole story through this questionnaire that I've put together and analyzing the stats a little differently than people like Eric Kane and I think also Nerdrotic and a lot of other articles out there. They've taken basically Luminate's data and their reports and gone off of that and not really looked at what the data itself is saying. Unfortunately, Luminate isn't really giving out much of the data besides showing charts and ranking shows. So I think also there was maybe one other site that also gives a ranking for the Rings of Power. So this is basically about not just the fans who are watching Rings of Power, but this is about anybody who's watching it. And that's why I created this form, a questionnaire that you can find in the description of this episode. And hopefully it will give a better idea of what people think about the show. And not just views, because the views that especially Illuminate is saying that it's taking off of, it's not actually talking about the number of people or unique viewers. It's talking about how, basically, I don't know, they're grabbing minutes each person is watching or so many people are watching it. So you can't really figure out if it's like 3 people in a room or what. So hopefully this form will give a better idea of that. I'll go into more of the stats in the second part of this episode, which I'm going to send out in like a month or so just to get enough time for people to actually fill out the questionnaire. And hopefully that will bring some light to things, and it should be interesting to see the results. So I'll be joined by Jared Stonefield, and please like and subscribe. And with that, let's dive right in. Welcome, my lords, to the White City, where you will learn more about Middle-earth and discover differences and similarities between the Rings of Power show and Tolkien's books, and whether Amazon's show, episode by episode, is worth watching. I'm Philip Dutt, your host, and I'll be joined by Matt Vandervoort and Mark Schaefer. I hope you enjoy. During this intermission between the Rings of Power Season 2 and Season 3, I'll be going over different characters of Middle-earth along with different artifacts of Middle-earth, and also the War of the Rohirrim and the Lord of the Rings trilogy, looking at lore accuracies and inaccuracies. If you want to go back and listen to our Season 1 review, then go to the beginning of the podcast on any of those audio platforms. If you're on YouTube or those podcasting platforms, then you can search Season 2, Episode 1 review, and it should come up. Hello, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to the White City Podcast. Today I've got back with me one of my guests, Jared Stonefield. It's great to have him back. And today we're going to be going over a little bit of, I guess, confirming what people have said about the enjoyment of the show, and like also some other ratings in a sense, I guess. So basically, I've put together my own form to see, not just from like fans, but also from just general people who've watched the show, to get an idea of what people actually think for myself, since I'm a little bit suspicious about people just pulling from, like, I don't know, it seems just like an article that everybody's pulling from, and I don't really know how to confirm that. So anyways, but I think that one thing One thing I guess that I think would be cool to start off with, Jared, is just like, what do you think makes like Tolkien's world of Middle Earth like so successful and so appealing to people?
Yeah, I think that one of its main appeals is that it's timeless. It draws on ancient bits of storytelling and mythology that have become a very big part of our pop culture subconscious, partially because of Tolkien, but also just because of the nature of storytelling itself. Um, the Lord of the Rings very closely follows the hero's journey, which is a very popular monomyth that's saturated into pop culture nowadays. And so I feel like, it's really timeless to a lot of people. And also, like, a lot of people grew up with Tolkien one way or another. It was either because they grew up, like, hearing their parents read the books to them, or they grew up watching the Peter Jackson films. I know some people who actually their first exposure to Tolkien was actually watching like the old cartoons from like the Russian cartoons from like the 1980s or something like that, or 70s. So yeah, I think a lot of kids are exposed to Tolkien in one way or another, and just having that whole other world that is so different from almost anything else in fiction, of like dragons and wizards, and like this is the classic stuff, but it's also just so inviting, and it's also so expansive at the same time. Tolkien knew how to make Middle Earth very, very personal, and very warm and inviting, but at the same time, it has this incredible scope that, I mean, as a kid, you can just listen to hearing about it for hours and hours because there's just so much to explore. I think that's what a lot of people love about it.
Yeah, for sure. So I think, what do you think about it being like relatable in some ways? Even though it's a fantasy world, it still has a lot of aspects to it that, like, in a sense, we can still relate to.
Exactly. Yeah, I think even though we can't relate to a lot of the characters necessarily, because like a lot of the characters are like immortal elves or you know kings of men, I think we can all relate to a lot of the things that they come across, which are extremely hard decisions, persisting through very dark times. And a lot of them have, even though they're mythic heroes, a lot of them have the same goals as everyday people, especially the hobbits. Their goal is to eventually find peace, go home, have a nice drink, sit by the fire, and enjoy the well earned, hard fought peace that they have. And I think that's what a lot of people just can relate to at the end of the day. It's something that you don't get to see much of in stories nowadays. So it's kind of just something that I think a lot of people can at least relate to on some level, even if you can't relate to a lot of like the other things that these characters come from. You can at least relate to what they go through and what they want.
Yeah, so the timelessness definitely being like, I think, a big factor that uh, people will pull from when talking about just like the success, and I think why so many people just like are still like into it and come back to it in a lot of ways. But do you think, is there something else besides just like it being timeless that also draws people to like to being interested in it?
Yeah, I think also just like it's I mean, it was so imaginative for its time, and it still is. I mean, it is the blueprint for so much fantasy. If you ask almost any single fantasy writer who is alive today, they will say that one of their foremost inspirations is J.R.R. Tolkien, just because
Yeah.
he did so much in such relatively little time. I mean, I understand that he only was able to publish 4 books, um, but those 4 books have, an entire world inside of them. And he also wrote enough notes and um, stories to fill countless other books that his son spent his entire life trying to like go through and publish. And I think it just continually blows people's minds with how much there is and the amount of care and detail that is put into every single part of his works. I mean, every time a hill is mentioned, a hill has a story. Like
It
there's
does.
every single stream has some sort of story attached to it. And I think that just that kind of passion is really what is like a magnet to people and readers.
Yeah.
At least it is for me.
No, I think that's a good point. I've been listening through the books, or like the Fellowship of the Ring I listened to, and then listening to the Two Towers, and it's like sometimes it's a little bit rough to get through because of all the details that are mentioned. Like there are some parts where I'm like, oh, I just missed that, and then I'm like, well, if I go back to it, I don't know how much I'm actually missing besides like him describing the trees, you
Yeah.
know. Um,
He does love his nature descriptions.
yeah, his nature descriptions, yeah, it's just crazy, but um, I mean, it shows that he's a good writer. And another thing too is how you know, he published 4 books, but still had like all this information that he had, right? And it's just interesting, also like where you learn that he was such a perfectionist too, that like he couldn't get like he could have, I don't know, somebody else might have been able to publish the Lord of the Rings like earlier than he did, just because of how much he was a perfectionist about it, I guess. But I guess in a sense that made it good. Um, so so you think about like why people, I guess, are kind of, I don't know, why there are fans that are so passionate about this, I guess. Um, I think that's part of it. I think it's part of why I think that fans have such an opinion about the show. Um, and maybe I mean, this is really the only like fan base like I follow, so I don't really know about Marvel fans or Star Wars fans, what they're like talking about with all the stuff that's coming out now. But um, yeah, so it definitely, I guess it's I guess in a sense, what do you think about like Amazon, I guess, kind of reaching or like portraying that timelessness in the show? Is that what people are missing?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I think the part of the problem with making any sort of adaptation of Lord of the Rings, especially a new, completely new story that's only based off of a few chapters of the Silmarillion and a few notes and chapters from other books, is that first you have a story that people are unfamiliar with. I mean, the vast populace of people, the diehard Tolkien community, does not have that problem, but like the vast majority of people, aren't familiar with it, but they have an idea about what Lord of the Rings looks like, either through the Peter Jackson films or through the published like Hobbit or Lord of the Rings books that Tolkien wrote and published in his lifetime. So I think I don't care what film company or anything made, it was going to be very heavily scrutinized, no matter what. Um, so you kind of already have an impossible task right there. It's like a Herculean labor. Um, because people have such a deep and strong connection to Tolkien's work. It's part of their childhoods. Um, Amazon coming in and attempting to make a show, uh, it's gonna bear a lot of people's scrutiny. It's gonna bear a lot of people's hopes and expectations. And if it doesn't exactly meet those expectations, there's going to be a lot of negative reactions to that. Um, so yeah, with Amazon and the Rings of Power, I think that part of the problem of the show, as much as I love the show, I think part of the problem of the show is that ironically it is kind of the opposite of what I was expected it was going to be. I think it actually struggles a bit more with like the timeless, mythic, grand aspects of it. And it focuses a lot more on like the smaller characters, the smaller plot lines, the smaller scale things, which, to be completely honest, like I was not expecting this show to face that problem. When I first heard about this show and I heard how big of a budget it had and that Amazon was producing it and that It was going to be like, about the forging of the rings and the rise of Sauron. I was kind of worried that it was going to be battle after battle after battle, and all this, like, just it was just going to kind of be this soulless, um, high fantasy kind of imitation of Lord of the Rings. And I was very pleasantly surprised that that wasn't the case, but it also at the same time, uh, I think has kind of lost people in the sense of that it's been so small scale, and it does struggle a bit with action and with the higher fantasy concepts. Like for example, the first season, the big climactic battle of the first season is a very small skirmish in what will one day become Mordor. And then the only actual battle that we've had in the show so far is the Battle of Eregion, which wasn't bad by any means, but it had a lot of like problems with it. Just like from a just from a casual viewer standpoint, production standpoint, there was a lot of good stuff, but there was also a lot of like, eh. So I think that's something that the show is really going to have to work on if it wants to keep not only its audience but also draw in new viewers as the seasons go on, because the seasons are only going to get more and more epic. So it has to like I think it's done a really good job of like having a lot of those more character driven and smaller details. I think it now just needs to kick into higher gear as the story kicks into higher gear.
Yeah, yeah. Living up to those expectations is the hard part for sure. So, and one thing that is also interesting, not necessarily like a lore thing at all, but I've yeah, I've seen fans react with kind of the essence of like, oh, this is an abomination to Tolkien. This is like, it's horrible. Um and I it's like it's to everybody's got their opinion and their and their taste of things, which I get that, but it's I don't know, like I guess just like something that like it's kind of like off of off the top of my head. I just kind of like, yeah, like Tolkien's great, but like I'm not like dying on a hill for him. So but I just feel like that's like kind of, it seems like that's the level that some fans get to.
Oh, for sure.
Um, but I wouldn't necessarily call it. I don't know if you would go there or not.
No, no. Yeah, no. No, I adore Tolkien's work. I consider myself maybe not like an expert, but pretty darn close.
For
I would
sure.
say
Yeah.
a good chunk of my brain capacity is devoted to Middle Earth lore. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I understand that people may not like the show. I totally get it. I know several people who don't like it. I know several people who love it. I think calling it an abomination is going many steps too far. Um, is it how Tolkien would have had his work adapted? I'm not sure. Tolkien was very clear in his letters to producers that he knew that there were big changes between the silver screen and the book. He talked to a producer or script writer, I believe, about a potential Lord of the Rings adaptation one time, and he was fully prepared to have the Battle of Helm's Deep cut. He's like, yeah, I can understand that it's not going to fit in the story, that it's just going to have to probably be let go. So I don't think and that Tolkien was as uh, obsessed with his own mythology as some people think he was. I do believe he was very, very protective of it and passionate about it.
Interesting.
Um, I don't know if he would hate or if he would love this adaptation. Um, but I also really try to think about the heart behind the actors and the showrunners who make this show. I know that people try to like always, give a very generic like, well, Amazon does this and everything. But like Amazon the company is different from the people that are producing the show. I mean, So, like, I mean, obviously, Amazon has input. Jeff Bezos, for example, had notes for the showrunners. Um, that's just a normal Hollywood thing. So, yes, Amazon is very heavily involved with the show, but this show isn't being run or written by Amazon lackeys who are just getting like paid from the desk of Jeff Bezos. Like I've listened to many podcasts with these guys, and like read a lot of like articles and that they've given. They are very passionate about the source material,
They know it
and
pretty
I
well
think that
too. Like,
yeah,
yeah.
and several of the actors are, and so I think that like you can hate this show, you can hate it. You can think that Tolkien would hate it, and that uh, it's not to your taste at all. It's fine. I get it. But saying that it's an abomination or that it's just a cash grab, that's where I'm like, okay, all right, let's stop here, because I don't think it is. It's not. I don't think it's an objectively bad show either. I think if you watch many of the shows that come out from like Netflix and things like that, it's just like, ooh. And then you watch Rings of Power and you realize there is a difference here, in just the terms of quality of like care that's put into the show. So yeah,
Hmm.
I do have problems when people start to call this show a cash grab, because also like people like the amount of money that has been poured into this show, it's clearly not a cash grab. Like if it was a cash grab, they would be throwing as little money as possible and trying to get as much in as return. But they're not selling merchandise for this show like at all. And they are investing a lot of money into it, and they have big fans for this show as the showrunners. They actually passed up multiple people, including potentially Joe and Anthony Russo, the directors of Avengers Endgame. They were some of the ones who had pitches for what the show could be like, and the Tolkien estate was like, no. And they actually went with uh, McKay, JD
Okay.
Patrick and McKay,
Yeah.
because they saw that they were big fans. So I just think that has something to do with it.
Yeah. So so about like the cash grab thing, something I think that I like in my mind, I think about it as well. If you're creating a show on something, you're gonna try to make money with it. So in a sense, like at the end of the day, like they are trying to make money,
Yeah.
and kind of make it to like suit their needs in some ways. Um, I just yeah, it's just crazy. I don't know. It's like the one. It's like the. This is like I don't know. Maybe I'm not just like watching a ton of other shows to get this idea that you have people who are so passionately against it, and it's like, oh, I just don't like it because of the lore, and then you like go to somebody like you, Jared, and you're like, like you almost know everything about the lore, and it's like you like it, and it's like okay, like okay, like where's the give here? It's like I don't know, I don't know. And it's that's why I just find it so interesting to be like, I just can't. I just can't. I don't know. When people ask me like, "Oh, like should I watch it?" or like, "Did you like the show?" like one person on like Facebook, I just like on the comment, I was like, "Yeah, I'd give it a B for like enjoyment." Like, but like I don't know. It's hard for me to really just like to say all out that like, yeah, I think this is like the best show I've ever seen. Um, but yeah, so that's interesting. So let's move a little bit on to more of like your kind of rating of the show and why. And I like I'd like sent you the form that I put together for like reviews already. And I know like I think you gave like a 5 out of 5 for like comparing it to just shows in general. I think for lore like what you were like almost a 5 for lore
No, so it was season 1 I gave it a 3, and then for season 2 I gave it a 4.
for lore wise.
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
I know that that would be a very controversial rating amongst some circles. Um, I I tend to be much more forgiving when it comes to adaptations, because I think that uh, the problem with the Second Age, that this show is based off of is, I mean, we've talked about this before in other episodes of this podcast, is the time compression. Um, because every single episode of the Rings of Power should technically be like 100 years apart, and that is, it's just impossible to tell a story that way on a visual medium.
Yeah.
If you want to talk about losing your general audience, like the casual viewer, that would be the way to do it. Um, so I understand that people can get frustrated with like, well, this and this didn't happen simultaneously, and I'm like, yeah, I get that, but I think it really needed to happen. That way we could actually have a somewhat coherent show. So I'm a lot more forgiving on that. I think that the main problem would be, you know, like kind of like the reordering of some of the things that they did, or like maybe stretching too far some of the liberties that were taken. But, and that's more in season one, because season one isn't even really based off of much of Tolkien's lore, just because we don't have much knowledge about the stuff that season one covers. Like, we don't really know how Mordor became volcanic again, which is actually ends up being like one of the main plot points of season one. We don't really know much about what Galadriel was even up to in the Second Age. Um, so yeah, I understand that it's not like super lore accurate, but I think that they do try and incorporate a lot of things that they can into the first season. Um, Again, with are there things that I would change? Of course, there are plenty of things that I wish that we had seen that we hadn't, or that we saw that I was like, I could have done without. But overall, I felt like, you know, it was at least trying to stay true to the general tenor of Tolkien's world.
Yeah, for sure. Now, how about like comparing season 1 and season 2? I think that's kind of interesting to hear people like talk about those differences, yeah,
Oh
and lore
yeah,
wise and all.
oh yeah.
So,
Season two uh, is both more lore accurate and is also just based off of more lore in general. Because I mean, a lot of season two is just straight out of uh the Silmarillion. Um, Even though technically, legally, it may not be supposed to, but whatever. Um, yeah.
gotcha.
So I thoroughly enjoy season two. I understand that they rearranged some of the forging of the rings. I think that that actually serves the show much better. Um, I mean, yes,
Interesting.
I understand it caused some complications with the story, um, but for reasons I won't burden the podcast with right now, I think trying to make the Rings of Power in the exact way that Tolkien had described it would be a somewhat confusing narrative. Also, just because like Tolkien didn't even fully decide the ordering of how the rings were made or lost or who they were made for. He kept going back and forth on it. So I do try to keep that in mind as well. It's a weird gray area.
Yeah, Tolkien definitely went back and forth on a lot of things, I think. Yeah.
Up
uh
until the last possible moment in some
yeah.
cases.
So, yeah, that's no, that's I think that in general, well, in general is kind of always tough to say with this, but I thought season 2 was better, and so it's interesting when people were like going through season 2 and like decided to not watch it anymore because they didn't think it was as good as season 1. And so that's just like that's just one thing I yeah, I couldn't entirely understand. But so after I like take all these results, what do you think's gonna be like the general consensus? Do you think it's gonna be negative or positive?
I think it will. Hmm, I think it'll be 60-40, and the 60 will be negative. So here's the thing. When it comes to people I have talked to like more online about it, or like seen online reactions of, those are always more negative. Always. When I talk to people in person about it, it is so much more positive. I think that part of the thing with Rings of Power is that it does not have a super strong online positive fan presence. I think that when there are fans that really like it, they feel like they have to constantly defend it, which is not a great way to like encourage like a really strong fan base. Well, that's not like anyone's fault per se. Um, it's just like when Game of Thrones was coming out, for example. I mean, Game of Thrones had people who hated it, but it also had like a very strong fan base. And even as the show got much worse later throughout, you still had like a good amount of people who were always trying to like it. And then I don't know. So Rings of Power, I feel like just had a very intense scrutiny from the start before it ever even started filming.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think that there's also just like not many people who like love the show because a lot of people have watched it. If Amazon's metrics are anything to go by. But I just think that not many of like the people who really enjoyed it are like talking about it a lot online. So when you look online, I think there's definitely a very strong um, negative tint. And also, unfortunately, I mean, I could go into a whole meta commentary about this, about how so much of online discussion of pop culture nowadays is more about the controversy and like rage bait than it is about like actually potentially enjoying a show. Um that's a whole other discussion. But yeah, no, so I think that I don't know, I think it's going to be somewhat down the middle when it comes to your results. I'm very
Yeah.
interested to hear. I'm very interested.
Yeah. For sure. Yeah. So
What are your expectations?
my expectations for it. So yeah, so one thing I do like what you said about difference between in person and online. Because I think that's gonna be the challenge with it is who I'm spreading this to. Because if I'm just spreading it to Reddit, then it's gonna be skewed like towards Reddit. If I'm just spreading it to Facebook, it's gonna be skewed towards Facebook. So I'm gonna have to like try to get people to like share this stuff um a lot across the board. And you know, I I say there's gonna be close to a 50-50 split. Whenever I did this for the last season, and I was just basically like, "Hey, do you like it or not, or did you just not watch it?" And basically, and I was trying to do it with just Lord of the Rings fans. This time though, I'm like, I'll know if you're a Lord of the Rings fan because of the content I put in there. So if you answer certain questions a certain way, I'll kind of have an idea of like where you fall with things. But with this, it was like trying to get mostly Lord of the Rings, Middle Earth fans, and it was like 50% liked it, and then it was like 45% didn't like it, and then like 5% didn't watch it because it wasn't worth watching, in their opinion. Um, so like, so even then, like, well, it's just interesting because what was put out was that there was only like 37% of all viewers of season one finished the
Yeah,
entire
I remember
show.
that. Yep.
And like that was the big thing that I was like, all right, we're gonna figure out if this is right. We're gonna see this. So I think that it's gonna be tough to really like because I don't. It's just you get people who are just it's just so across the board all the time. Is you can't like find it consistently. Everybody's calling it bad. You can't. And you can't find consistently like everybody like shouting praises about it either. So, but well, thanks, Jared, for coming on and recording this
Thanks
with
for
me and
having
giving your
me.
2 cents about stuff. Yeah, for sure. It's been a lot of fun. And so, so guys, yeah, check out the forum. And as I said here in the intro, it'll be in the description. And also, I'll be sharing it across Facebook. So please fill it out. Like, even if you haven't watched the show, even if you like aren't a Middle Earth fan and haven't read the books, like still like fill it out. That's like I'm anybody can do it. So um yeah, so catch us for episodes on characters in Middle Earth or other content, such as a War of the Rohirrim, which we have not gotten to yet, but thanks. Thanks for visiting the White City. Before you leave, please subscribe to our podcast and check us out at thewhitecitypodcast.com. We're on YouTube or Facebook under the tag @The White City Podcast.